The Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds from the ancient oak trees that lined the path to the gallows, swaying gently in the humid Louisiana breeze as if the very air itself mourned what was about to happen. I, Marie Laveau, not the famous New Orleans priestess, but a woman who shared her name and her power, stood among the crowd of enslaved people who had been forced to witness the execution of my 14-year-old son, Baptiste, for the unforgivable crime of stealing a single apple from Master Beauregard's prized orchard. 13 men had condemned my boy to death. Master Claude Beauregard himself, fat and sweating in his fine clothes, had pronounced the sentence with the casual indifference of a man swatting a fly. 12 overseers had nodded their agreement, their faces showing the kind of satisfaction that comes from exercising absolute power over the powerless. 13 souls who had decided that a child's life was worth less than a piece of fruit. Let this be a lesson to every slave on this plantation, Master Beauregard declared, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd like the pronouncement of a corrupt god. Theft will not be tolerated, regardless of the age of the thief or the value of what was stolen. Property is property, and those who violate the rights of property owners must face the consequences. Baptiste stood on the gallows platform with his hands bound behind his back, his young face showing the kind of dignity that comes from innocence, confronting evil. He had taken the apple not for himself, but for his younger sister Celeste, who had been sick with fever for 3 days and had been unable to keep down any food except fruit. But explanations meant nothing to men who saw enslaved people as livestock rather than human beings with families and feelings. "Mama," Baptiste called out, his voice clear and strong despite the terror he must have been feeling. "Take care of Celeste. Tell her I love her. Tell her the apple was sweet." Those were the last words my son would ever speak. The trapdoor opened beneath his feet, and the rope snapped his neck with a sound like breaking kindling. My beautiful boy, my firstborn child, my pride and joy, was dead at the age of 14, murdered by 13 men who had convinced themselves that his life had no value. But they were wrong about the value of his life, and they were about to learn just how wrong they were. As I stood there watching my son's body swing in the humid air, as I listened to the satisfied murmurs of the 13 men who had killed him, as I felt the weight of grief and rage settling into my bones like a physical presence, I began to plan their destruction with the methodical precision of a master craftsman. I was Marie Laveau, daughter of Marie Laveau, granddaughter of Marie Laveau, a line of women who had carried the ancient knowledge of our African ancestors across the ocean and through the generations of bondage that had tried to strip us of everything that made us human. The power that flowed in my veins was older than slavery, older than America, older than the Christian God that Master Beauregard claimed, gave him dominion over other human beings. The 13 men who had murdered my son had no idea what they had awakened. They saw me as just another grieving slave woman, powerless to strike back against their authority, condemned to accept their judgment and move on with my life as if nothing had happened. But they had never encountered the fury of a mother whose child had been stolen from her, had never faced the wrath of a woman who commanded forces that their limited understanding could not comprehend. As the crowd began to disperse and the overseers started herding the enslaved people back to their quarters, I remained standing beneath the gallows where my son's body still hung. I reached up and touched his foot, feeling the warmth that was already beginning to fade from his flesh, and I made a vow that would shake the very foundations of the Beauregard plantation. 13 men killed you, my baby, I whispered, my voice barely audible but carrying the weight of absolute certainty. 13 men will die for what they have done. 1 for each day, 1 for each year of your life, 1 for each breath they stole from your lungs. This I swear by the spirits of our ancestors, by the power that flows in my blood, by the love that will never die, even though your body has been broken. The Spanish moss stirred in the breeze as if the very trees were listening to my words, and somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird began to sing a song that sounded like a funeral dirge. The spirits were already gathering, drawn by the promise of justice and the scent of blood that would soon flow in payment for the innocent life that had been taken. Master Beauregard and his 12 overseers had no idea that they had just signed their own death warrants. They thought they had demonstrated their power by killing a child for stealing an apple, but they had actually sealed their fate by murdering the son of a woman who could call upon forces beyond their comprehension or control. The plantation house stood in the distance like a white monument to human cruelty, its columns and porches designed to project an image of genteel southern civilization. But I could see through the facade to the rot that lay beneath, could smell the spiritual corruption that emanated from men who had built their wealth on the systematic brutalization of other human beings. That night, as the plantation settled into an uneasy quiet, and the other slaves whispered prayers for Baptiste's soul, I began the work that would transform their casual cruelty into a nightmare beyond their wildest imagination. In the small cabin that I shared with Celeste and 2 other slave women, I cleared a space on the dirt floor and began to gather the materials I would need to craft the instruments of their destruction. 13 dolls, 1 for each of the men who had killed my son. Each doll would be crafted with meticulous attention to detail, incorporating personal items from its intended victim. Hair, clothing fibers, nail clippings, anything that would create a spiritual connection between the doll and the man it represented. Each doll would be blessed with the ancient rituals that my grandmother had taught me, charged with the power of the spirits, who demanded justice for the innocent blood that had been spilled. The first doll I created was for Master Beauregard himself, the man who had pronounced the death sentence with such casual indifference. I used clay from the banks of the Mississippi River, mixed with graveyard dirt and the blood from my own finger, to form the basic shape. Spanish moss from the hanging tree served as hair, while a scrap of fabric torn from one of his discarded shirts provided the clothing. As I worked, I chanted the words that my grandmother had taught me, calling upon the spirits of our ancestors to witness my work and bless my purpose. The Loa who governed justice and revenge stirred in response to my call, and I could feel their presence filling the small cabin like smoke from a sacred fire. Papa Legba, opener of the way, I call upon you to clear the path for justice, I whispered, my hands shaping the clay with practiced skill. Baron Samedi, Lord of the Dead, I ask you to prepare a place for those who have murdered the innocent. Erzuli Dantor, Fierce Mother, I beg you to lend me your strength in this work of righteous vengeance. The doll took shape under my fingers, becoming more than just clay and moss and fabric, becoming a vessel for the spiritual forces that would soon claim Master Beauregard's life. When it was complete, I held it up to the moonlight that filtered through the cabin's single window, and I could swear I saw it move slightly, as if already animated by the power I had invested in it. Claude Beauregard, I said, speaking directly to the doll as if it were the man himself, you killed my son for an apple. Now you will pay with your life for that apple. The spirits have heard my call, and they are coming for you. I wrapped the doll in a piece of black cloth and placed it in the wooden box where I kept my most sacred items, the bones and herbs and stones that connected me to the spiritual realm that existed parallel to the world of slavery and oppression. Tomorrow I would begin work on the second doll, and the day after that the third, until all 13 instruments of justice had been completed and blessed. But even as I planned the creation of the remaining dolls, I could feel the power building around the first one, could sense the spiritual forces gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. Master Beauregard had less than 2 weeks to live, for though he had no idea that his death was already approaching, with the inexorable certainty of the tide. The other 12 men who had participated in my son's murder would follow him into the grave, one by one, day by day, until the debt of blood had been paid in full. The plantation that had taken my child's life would become a charnel house, a monument to the terrible price that must be paid when innocent blood is spilled for the sake of maintaining an evil system. I thought of Baptiste as I worked, remembering his laugh and his gentle nature, his love for his little sister, and his dreams of someday being free. He had been a good boy, kind and generous and full of hope despite the circumstances of his birth. He had deserved to live, to grow up, to have children of his own and tell them stories about their grandmother who had loved them before they were even born. Instead, he was dead, his body hanging from a rope because 13 men had decided that his life was worth less than an apple. But his death would not be in vain. It would be the catalyst for a reckoning that would shake the foundations of the plantation system itself, would demonstrate to anyone who cared to pay attention that there were forces in the world more powerful than whips and chains, and the casual cruelty of men who thought themselves gods. The Spanish moss outside my window stirred in the night breeze, and somewhere in the darkness, I could hear the sound of drums. Not physical drums, but the spiritual rhythm that connected all the children of Africa to their ancestral homeland and the powers that dwelt there. The spirits were awakening, drawn by the promise of justice and the scent of blood that would soon flow in payment for the crime that had been committed. 13 men had killed my son. 13 men would die. The count would begin tomorrow, and it would not end until the last of them had paid the ultimate price for their participation in the murder of an innocent child. The voodoo dolls that would serve as the instruments of their destruction were already taking shape in my mind, each one crafted with the specific purpose of claiming a particular life in a particular way. The spirits would guide my hands as I worked, would bless each doll with the power to reach across the spiritual realm and claim its intended victim. Master Beauregard and his 12 overseers thought they had demonstrated their power by killing a child, but they had actually awakened something far more dangerous than they could imagine. The mother whose son they had murdered was about to become their nemesis, and the ancient powers she served were already sharpening their claws for the feast of vengeance that was about to begin. The second night after Baptiste's execution, I began work on the remaining 12 dolls that would serve as the instruments of divine justice. Each one required careful planning and precise execution. As the spiritual connection between the doll and its intended victim had to be perfect for the curse to take hold. I had learned these arts from my grandmother, who had learned them from her grandmother before her, in an unbroken chain of knowledge that stretched back to the motherland across the ocean. The second doll was for Samuel Briggs, the head overseer who had been the first to agree with Master Beauregard's death sentence. Briggs was a cruel man who took pleasure in the suffering of others, who had personally administered countless beatings and had been known to separate families for his own amusement. He kept a collection of whips in his cabin, each one designed for a specific type of punishment, and he maintained them with the care that other men might show to fine musical instruments. I had managed to obtain a few strands of his hair from the barbershop in town, where he went every month to have his beard trimmed. The barber, a free man of color named Jean-Baptiste, was sympathetic to the plight of enslaved people and had quietly collected the hair clippings when I explained what I needed them for. He understood the power of voodoo and respected the justice it could provide when the law offered no recourse. The clay for Briggs's doll came from the same riverbank as the first, but I mixed it with different elements to reflect his particular nature and the specific death that awaited him. Red clay for the violence he had inflicted on others, graveyard dirt from the tomb of a man who had died by choking, and a few drops of my own blood to seal the spiritual connection. As I shaped the doll, I could feel the presence of Baron Samedi growing stronger, his laughter echoing in the spiritual realm as he prepared to claim another victim. The Lord of the Dead took particular pleasure in collecting the souls of those who had caused suffering to others, and he was eager to add Samuel Briggs to his collection. "Samuel Briggs," I whispered to the doll as I worked, "you have whipped the flesh from the backs of innocent people, have separated children from their mothers, have taken pleasure in the pain of those who could not fight back. Now you will learn what it means to suffer, to struggle for breath, to feel your life slipping away while others watch and do nothing to help." The third doll was for Marcus Cole, the youngest of the overseers, a man barely 25 years old who had already developed a reputation for creative cruelty. He specialized in psychological torture, using threats and humiliation to break his victims' spirits before resorting to physical violence. He had a particular hatred for children, viewing them as future threats to the plantation's security, and he had been especially vocal in his support for Baptiste's execution. For Cole's doll, I used Spanish moss that had been soaked in swamp water, symbolizing the drowning death that awaited him. The clay was mixed with mud from the bottom of the bayou, where the spirits of those who had died by water were said to dwell. A button from his coat, obtained by bribing one of the house slaves who did his laundry, provided the personal connection that would allow the curse to find its target. "Marcus Cole," I said, holding the completed doll up to the moonlight, "you have delighted in the tears of children, have found pleasure in breaking the spirits of those who should have been protected. The waters will claim you, will fill your lungs as you have filled others' hearts with despair. The fourth doll was for William Frost, an overseer known for his use of fire as a tool of punishment. He had burned the hands of slaves who had been caught stealing, had used red-hot irons to brand the faces of those who had attempted to escape, and had once forced a group of field hands to watch as he burned down their small chapel, because they had been holding unauthorized religious services. Frost's doll was crafted with clay that had been fired in a kiln, then mixed with ashes from the burned chapel and a few threads from a shirt that had been scorched during one of his punishment sessions. The spiritual irony was perfect. The man who had used fire as a weapon would himself be consumed by flames. "William Frost," I intoned, feeling the heat of spiritual fire beginning to build around the doll, "you have burned the flesh of the innocent, have destroyed the sacred places where people sought comfort in their suffering. Now you will burn as you have made others burn, will feel the flames consuming your flesh as you have consumed the hope of those under your power." Each successive doll required more careful planning and more specific spiritual preparations. The fifth doll was for James Porter, a man who took pride in his ability to break horses and had applied the same techniques to breaking human beings. The sixth was for Thomas Nash, who had developed a system of punishment based on starvation and had delighted in watching his victims grow weak and desperate. The seventh doll represented Henry Walsh, an overseer who specialized in the use of dogs to track runaway slaves and who had trained his pack to be particularly vicious in their attacks on captured fugitives. The eighth was for Robert Kane, a man who had made a science of the whip and could deliver exactly the number of lashes needed to cause maximum pain without killing his victim. The ninth doll was crafted for Michael O'Brien, an Irish immigrant who had embraced the plantation system with the fervor of a convert, determined to prove his worthiness to be accepted by the established white community. The 10th represented David Murphy, another Irishman who had found in the overseer's position a way to exercise the power that had been denied to him in his homeland. The 11th doll was for Patrick Sullivan, a man whose cruelty was matched only by his stupidity, who had risen to his position through his willingness to follow orders without question or conscience. The 12th was for Sean O'Malley, the youngest of the overseers, who had been eager to prove himself worthy of his position by exceeding even his colleagues in the brutality of his punishments. Each doll was crafted with specific materials that reflected the nature of its intended victim and the death that awaited him. Each was blessed with the appropriate rituals and charged with the spiritual power necessary to reach across the veil between the physical and spiritual worlds. Each was wrapped in black cloth and placed in my sacred box, where the combined power of all 13 dolls would build and focus until it became an unstoppable force of divine justice. As I worked on the final dolls, I could feel the spiritual pressure building in the small cabin, could sense the presence of the lower growing stronger with each completed figure. The air itself seemed to thicken with power, and the other women who shared the cabin began to complain of strange dreams and unexplained sensations. "Marie," whispered Celeste, my surviving daughter, as she watched me work on the 13th and final doll. "What are you doing? I can feel something in the air, something that makes my skin crawl and my heart race." "I am preparing justice for your brother," I replied, not looking up from my work. 13 men killed Baptiste, and 13 men will pay the price for his life. The spirits have heard my call, and they are gathering to collect what is owed. The 13th doll was the most important of all, as it represented Master Beauregard himself, the man who had pronounced the death sentence, who had condemned my son to die for the crime of trying to feed his sick sister. This doll required the most powerful spiritual preparations, the most carefully selected materials, the most potent blessings. The clay came from the graveyard where the plantation's former masters were buried, mixed with dirt from the crossroads where the spirits were said to gather at midnight. Spanish moss from the hanging tree served as hair, while a piece of fabric torn from Master Beauregard's own pillow provided the personal connection. The doll was anointed with oils that had been blessed by the spirits of justice and revenge, and it was wrapped in cloth that had been stained with my own tears. "Claude Beauregard," I said, holding the completed doll in both hands as I felt the full power of the spiritual realm focusing on this single figure. "You are the architect of my son's death, The man who decided that his life was worth less than an apple. You will be the last to die. We'll watch as your overseers fall one by one. We'll understand that the power you thought you wielded was nothing compared to the forces you have awakened. With all 13 dolls completed and blessed, I arranged them in a circle on the floor of the cabin, each one facing inward toward a candle that burned with a flame that seemed to dance to its own rhythm. The spiritual energy in the room was now so intense that it was almost visible, creating shadows that moved independently of the candlelight and sounds that seemed to come from another world entirely. I began the final ritual that would activate the curse, calling upon all the spirits who govern justice and revenge to witness my work and bless my purpose. The words I spoke were in the old language that my grandmother had taught me, the sacred tongue that connected all the children of Africa to their ancestral homeland and the powers that dwelt there. "Spirits of the ancestors, hear my call," I chanted, feeling the power building around me like a storm about to break. A child has been murdered, innocent blood has been spilled, justice has been denied by those who claim to serve it. I call upon you to right this wrong, to claim the lives of those who took the life of my son, to demonstrate that there are powers in this world greater than the whips and chains of mortal men. The candle flame suddenly flared higher, casting dancing shadows on the walls as the spirits responded to my call. I could feel their presence filling the cabin, could sense their eagerness to begin the work of justice that had been too long delayed. The 13 dolls seemed to pulse with their own inner light, each one connected to its intended victim by invisible threads of spiritual power. "Let the count begin," I whispered, feeling the curse take hold with the finality of a judge's gavel. 13 days, 13 deaths, 13 payments for the life of one innocent child. Let no one say that the blood of the innocent can be spilled without consequence, that the powerless have no recourse against the powerful, that the spirits of our ancestors have forgotten how to deliver justice to those who deserve it. The ritual was complete, the curse was activated, and the countdown to justice had begun. Tomorrow, the first of the 13 men would die, and each day thereafter would bring another death until the debt had been paid in full. Master Beauregard and his overseers had no idea what was coming for them, had no understanding of the forces they had awakened when they decided to murder a child for stealing an apple. But they would learn, one death at a time, that there were powers in the world more ancient and more terrible than their casual cruelty, that the blood of the innocent cried out for vengeance from the spiritual realm, and that a mother's love could reach beyond the grave to claim justice for her murdered child. The voodoo dolls sat in their circle like silent sentinels, each one charged with the power to claim a specific life in a specific way. The spirits were gathering, drawn by the promise of blood and the scent of justice too long delayed. The plantation that had seemed so secure in its power was about to become a charnel house, and the men who had thought themselves untouchable were about to learn the true meaning of fear. Dawn broke grey and humid over the Beauregard plantation on the morning that would mark the beginning of the end for 13 men who had murdered an innocent child. As I went about my daily duties in the big house, serving breakfast, cleaning rooms, pretending to be the submissive slave that they expected me to be, I could feel the spiritual forces I had awakened stirring like a gathering storm, preparing to claim their first victim. The 13 voodoo dolls remained hidden in my cabin, wrapped in black cloth and charged with the power to reach across the veil between worlds and claim the lives of those who had condemned my son to death. But their influence was already spreading throughout the plantation like an invisible plague, touching the minds and bodies of the marked men with the first whispers of their approaching doom. Samuel Briggs, the head overseer who would be the first to die, seemed unusually agitated as he made his morning rounds. I watched him from the kitchen window as he inspected the slave quarters, noting the way he kept touching his throat and clearing it as if something were stuck there. The spiritual noose was already tightening around his neck, though he had no idea what was happening to him. "Something wrong with your throat, Mr. Briggs?" asked one of the field hands, a man named Joshua, who had felt the sting of Briggs's whip more times than he could count. "Mind your own business, boy," Briggs snapped, but his voice was already beginning to sound strained, as if speaking required more effort than usual. "Get back to work before I give you something real to worry about." But even as he made his threats, Briggs continued to cough and clear his throat, his hand moving unconsciously to his neck as if trying to loosen an invisible collar. The spirits were already at work, preparing his body for the death that would come with the setting of the sun. I went about my duties with the calm satisfaction of someone who knew that justice was finally being served. As I dusted Master Beauregard's study, I could see him through the window, standing on the front porch and surveying his domain with the smug satisfaction of a man who believed himself untouchable. He had no idea that his own death was only 12 days away, that the spiritual forces gathering around his plantation would soon claim his life along with those of his subordinates. The other overseers went about their daily routines, unaware that they were living their final days on Earth. Marcus Cole supervised the field hands with his usual cruelty. William Frost inspected the equipment with his characteristic attention to detail, and the others carried out their duties as if nothing had changed. But I could see the signs of spiritual interference beginning to manifest. Small accidents, moments of confusion, a general sense of unease that seemed to settle over the entire plantation like a fog. As the day progressed, Briggs's condition worsened noticeably. His voice became increasingly hoarse, and he began to have difficulty swallowing even liquids. By afternoon, he was coughing almost constantly, a harsh barking sound that echoed across the plantation and drew worried glances from the other overseers. "Maybe you should see the doctor," suggested Marcus Cole during their afternoon meeting. "That cough doesn't sound natural." "It's just the humid air," Briggs replied. But his voice was barely above a whisper now, and speaking seemed to cause him considerable pain. "I'll be fine by tomorrow." But he would not be fine by tomorrow. As evening approached and the sun began to set over the Louisiana bayou, I could feel the spiritual forces I had awakened focusing their attention on their first target. The voodoo doll that represented Samuel Briggs was calling to its counterpart in the physical world, drawing his life force across the veil between worlds and preparing to claim what was owed. I was serving dinner in the big house when the final act began. Through the dining room window, I could see Briggs stumbling across the yard toward his cabin. One hand clutched to his throat as he struggled to breathe. The other overseers had noticed his distress and were following him, their faces showing the first signs of genuine concern. "Samuel," called William Frost, "what's wrong? You look like you're choking." And indeed, that was exactly what was happening. The spiritual noose that had been tightening around Briggs's throat all day was now claiming its victim, cutting off his air supply with the inexorable certainty of physical rope. He fell to his knees in the dirt, his hands clawing at his neck as he fought for breath that would not come. The other overseers gathered around him, trying to help, but having no idea what was causing his distress. There was nothing physically wrong with his throat, no obstruction that could be removed, no injury that could be treated. The force that was killing him existed in the spiritual realm, beyond the reach of mortal medicine or intervention. "Get the doctor," Master Beauregard shouted from the porch, but even as the words left his mouth, Samuel Briggs convulsed once and lay still. His eyes stared sightlessly at the darkening sky, and his face was frozen in an expression of terror and disbelief. The first of the 13 men who had murdered my son was dead, claimed by forces beyond his understanding or control. The plantation erupted in confusion and alarm as word of Briggs's sudden death spread among the overseers and house slaves. Master Beauregard paced the porch like a caged animal, demanding explanations that no one could provide. The doctor, when he finally arrived, could find no cause of death. Briggs's body showed no signs of disease or injury, no indication of what had killed him. "It's like he just stopped breathing," the doctor told Master Beauregard, his voice reflecting his bewilderment. "I've never seen anything like it. A healthy man doesn't just die for no reason." But I knew the reason, and as I went about my duties in the big house, I felt a deep satisfaction at seeing the first payment extracted for my son's life. The spiritual forces I had awakened were proving their power, demonstrating that there were consequences for the murder of innocent children, that justice could be achieved even when the law provided no recourse. The second death came exactly 24 hours later, as I had known it would. Marcus Cole, the young overseer who had specialized in psychological torture, was found floating face down in the bayou that bordered the plantation. His body showed no signs of violence, no indication that he had been attacked or murdered. He had simply drowned, despite being an excellent swimmer who had grown up on the water. "He must have fallen from his horse," suggested one of the other overseers, but the horse was found grazing peacefully nearby, showing no signs of having thrown its rider. Maybe he had some kind of fit, lost consciousness and fell into the water, but there was no medical explanation for Cole's death. Just as there had been none for Briggs's, the voodoo doll that represented him had called to the spirits of the water, had drawn him to the bayou where the loa who governed drowning had claimed his life as payment for the suffering he had inflicted on others. The plantation was now in a state of barely controlled panic. 2 overseers dead in 2 days, both from unexplained causes, both in ways that defied rational explanation. Master Beauregard called a meeting of his remaining subordinates, demanding answers and explanations that none of them could provide. "This is just coincidence," he declared, but his voice lacked conviction. "2 unfortunate accidents, nothing more. We can't let superstition and fear interfere with the running of this plantation." But superstition and fear were exactly what was needed to understand what was happening. The rational world of white supremacy and plantation management had no framework for comprehending the spiritual forces that were systematically claiming the lives of those who had murdered an innocent child. The 3rd death came on schedule, as I had known it would. William Frost, the overseer who had specialized in using fire as a tool of punishment, was found burned to death in his cabin. The fire had consumed only his body, leaving the rest of the room untouched, an impossibility that defied all natural laws but made perfect sense in the spiritual realm where justice was being dispensed. "The lamp must have exploded," suggested one of the remaining overseers, but there was no evidence of any lamp explosion, no sign of any accelerant that could have caused such a localized fire. Frost had simply burned, consumed by the same element he had used to torture others, claimed by the spirits of fire who had answered my call for justice. By the 4th day, the pattern was becoming clear even to those who refused to believe in the supernatural. 1 overseer was dying each day, each death occurring in a manner that reflected the specific cruelties that man had inflicted on others. The plantation was in chaos, with the remaining overseers afraid to sleep alone, and the enslaved population whispering about curses and spiritual retribution. "It's that Marie," I heard one of the house slaves whisper to another. "She's got the power, just like her grandmother did. She's calling down death on the men who killed her boy." "Hush," the other replied, glancing around nervously. "Don't let them hear you talking like that. They'll think we're all involved in whatever's happening." But the white men on the plantation were too frightened and confused to think clearly about anything. They were facing forces beyond their comprehension, confronting a power that their rational minds could not accept or understand. The absolute confidence that had once characterized their rule was crumbling in the face of deaths that defied explanation and a pattern that suggested supernatural intervention. The 4th death was James Porter, the man who had taken pride in his ability to break both horses and human beings. He was found trampled to death in the stable, his body crushed by hooves that had left no tracks in the dirt around him. The horses in the stable were calm and undisturbed, showing no signs of having been involved in any violent incident. The 5th death was Thomas Nash, who had developed a system of punishment based on starvation. He was found dead in his cabin, his body showing all the signs of having starved to death despite having eaten a full meal only hours before. His stomach was empty, his body was emaciated, and his face was frozen in an expression of desperate hunger. By the 6th day, Master Beauregard was beginning to crack under the pressure. He had lost half of his overseers in less than a week, and the plantation was becoming impossible to manage. The remaining white men were too frightened to venture out alone, and the enslaved population was beginning to show signs of hope and defiance that had been absent for years. "We need to bring in help," he told his wife during dinner, his voice shaking with barely controlled fear. "Call in the militia, bring in investigators from New Orleans, do something to stop whatever's happening here." But what was happening could not be stopped by militia or investigators. The spiritual forces I had awakened were beyond the reach of mortal intervention, guided by a justice that transcended human law and powered by a mother's love that would not be denied. The 6th death was Henry Walsh, the overseer who had specialized in using dogs to track runaway slaves. He was found mauled to death behind the kennels, his body torn apart by teeth and claws that had left no other traces. The dogs were found sleeping peacefully in their pens, showing no signs of having been involved in any attack. The seventh death was Robert Kane, the man who had made a science of the whip. He was found beaten to death in his cabin, his body showing the precise pattern of injuries that he had inflicted on countless slaves over the years. But there were no weapons at the scene, no signs of struggle, no indication of how the beating had been administered. As the first week of deaths concluded and the second week began, the plantation had been transformed from a symbol of white supremacy into a house of horrors where death stalked the corridors and claimed a new victim each day. The remaining overseers were barely functional, jumping at shadows and starting at every unexpected sound. But the count was not yet complete. 6 men had died, but 7 more remained to pay the price for my son's murder. The voodoo dolls continued their work, calling across the veil between worlds and claiming the lives of those who had condemned an innocent child to death for the crime of trying to feed his sick sister. Justice was being served one death at a time, and the spirits would not rest until the debt had been paid in full. The 8th day dawned with a pall of terror hanging over the Beauregard plantation, like a physical presence. Michael O'Brien, the Irish overseer who had embraced the plantation system with the fervor of a convert, was found dead in the cotton gin, his body crushed by machinery that had somehow activated itself during the night, despite being shut down and secured. The gears and wheels showed no signs of malfunction, no indication of how they had started moving, or why they had stopped after claiming their victim. Master Beauregard stood beside the body, his face pale and drawn, his hands shaking as he struggled to maintain some semblance of authority in the face of forces he could not understand or control. The plantation that had once been his pride and joy, his symbol of power and prosperity, had become a nightmare where death stalked the corridors and claimed a new victim each day with supernatural precision. "This has to stop," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the whispers of the enslaved people who had gathered to witness the latest manifestation of divine justice. "Someone is doing this. Someone is killing my overseers, and I want to know who." But even as he spoke the words, he seemed to understand their futility. The deaths that had plagued his plantation for over a week defied rational explanation, occurred in ways that suggested supernatural intervention rather than human agency. The rational world of plantation management and white supremacy had no framework for understanding what was happening, no tools for fighting an enemy that existed in the spiritual realm. I watched from the kitchen window as the remaining overseers gathered around their dead colleague, their faces showing the kind of fear that comes from confronting forces beyond human comprehension. David Murphy, Patrick Sullivan, and Sean O'Malley, 3 men who had once strutted around the plantation with the confidence of absolute power, now huddled together like frightened children, jumping at every shadow and starting at every unexpected sound. "We should leave," Murphy suggested, his Irish accent thick with terror. "Pack up and get out of here before whatever's killing us claims the rest of us." "And go where?" Sullivan replied, his voice cracking with strain. "This thing, whatever it is, it's not going to stop just because we change locations. It's following a pattern, picking us off one by one. Running won't save us." "Then what do you suggest?" O'Malley asked, his youthful face aged by a week of constant fear. "We can't fight something we can't see, can't understand what's killing us or how to stop it." They were right, of course. There was no escape from the justice that was being dispensed, no way to avoid the spiritual forces that had been awakened by the murder of an innocent child. The voodoo dolls that represented each of them were calling across the veil between worlds, drawing their life forces into the realm where the spirits of the ancestors waited to claim what was owed. The 9th death came that evening, as the sun set over the bayou and the Spanish moss stirred in the humid breeze. David Murphy was found hanged in his cabin, suspended from a rope that showed no signs of having been tied by human hands. The knots were unlike anything the other overseers had ever seen, complex patterns that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly, as if they existed partially in another dimension. "He didn't hang himself," Patrick Sullivan said, staring at the body with horrified fascination. "David wasn't the type to give up, wasn't the kind of man to take his own life. Someone did this to him." "But who?" Sean O'Malley asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Who could have gotten into his cabin without being seen, could have overpowered him and strung him up like that? And what kind of rope makes knots like those? They had no answers, because the answers lay in a realm they refused to acknowledge or understand. The spiritual forces that were claiming their lives one by one operated according to laws that transcended physical reality, followed patterns that reflected the cosmic justice that governed the universe beneath its surface appearance of chaos and randomness. Master Beauregard had called in help from New Orleans, bringing investigators and militia to try to solve the mystery of the dying overseers. But the men who arrived found nothing that their rational minds could comprehend, no evidence of human agency in the deaths that defied natural law. They interviewed the enslaved population, searching for signs of conspiracy or rebellion, but found only the kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from seeing justice finally served. "The slaves aren't talking," reported Captain Morrison, the militia officer who had been assigned to investigate the deaths. "They claim to know nothing about what's happening, but there's something in their eyes, like they're watching a show they've been waiting to see for years." "Of course they're enjoying this," Master Beauregard replied bitterly. "They see my overseers dying and they think it's some kind of divine retribution. But this isn't God's work. This is murder, plain and simple, and someone is going to pay for it." But he was wrong about the nature of what was happening, and his failure to understand the spiritual forces at work would ultimately contribute to his own destruction. The deaths that were claiming his overseers were indeed divine retribution, justice dispensed by powers older than Christianity and more terrible than any human agency. The 10th death was Patrick Sullivan, found frozen solid in his cabin despite the sweltering Louisiana heat. His body was covered with frost that melted as soon as it was touched, and his face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. The cabin showed no signs of any cooling mechanism, no indication of how the temperature could have dropped low enough to freeze a human being solid. "This is impossible," the doctor said, examining Sullivan's body with growing bewilderment. "You can't freeze to death in 90-degree weather. There's no natural explanation for what happened to this man." But natural explanations were irrelevant when dealing with supernatural forces. The spirits that governed ice and cold had answered my call for justice, had claimed Sullivan's life as payment for the suffering he had inflicted on others. The voodoo doll that represented him had called to the realm of winter and death, drawing the cold across the veil between worlds to claim its victim. By the 11th day, only Sean O'Malley remained among the overseers, a young man barely out of his teens who had been eager to prove himself worthy of his position by exceeding his colleagues in brutality. He was now a broken shell of his former self, unable to sleep or eat, jumping at every shadow and starting at every unexpected sound. "I'm going to die tomorrow," he told Master Beauregard, his voice flat with resignation. "Whatever's killing us, it's working its way through the list and I'm next. There's no point in running, no point in hiding. It's going to find me wherever I go." "Don't talk like that," Master Beauregard replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "We'll find a way to stop this. Find whoever's responsible and make them pay for what they've done." But even as he spoke the words, he seemed to understand their futility. 11 of his 12 overseers were dead, killed by forces that defied rational explanation and followed a pattern that suggested supernatural intervention. The plantation that had once been his symbol of power and prosperity had become a charnel house, where death claimed a new victim each day with clockwork precision. The 11th death came at midnight, as Sean O'Malley sat in the main house under armed guard, surrounded by militia soldiers who had been assigned to protect him. Despite their vigilance, despite their weapons and their training, they could do nothing to prevent the spiritual forces that claimed his life as he sat in their midst. O'Malley simply stopped breathing, his life force drawn across the veil between worlds by the voodoo doll that represented him. One moment he was alive and terrified, the next he was dead, his body showing no signs of violence or disease, no indication of what had killed him. The soldiers who had been guarding him could only stare in horror and bewilderment, unable to comprehend what they had witnessed. "How?" Captain Morrison asked, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and frustration. "How did he die? We were watching him, we were right here, and he just stopped living. There's no wound, no poison, no sign of what killed him." "It's voodoo," whispered one of the house slaves, a woman named Josephine, who had worked in the big house for over 20 years. Someone's put a curse on this place, called down the spirits to claim the lives of those who deserve to die. You can't fight the spirits with guns and soldiers. You can't protect someone who's been marked for death by the lower. Superstitious nonsense, Captain Morrison replied, but his voice lacked conviction. There's a rational explanation for what's happening here. Someone is killing these men and we're going to find out who. But they would never find a rational explanation, because none existed. The deaths that had claimed 11 overseers in 11 days were the work of spiritual forces that operated according to laws beyond human understanding, guided by a justice that transcended mortal comprehension. Now only Master Beauregard remained, the architect of my son's death, the man who had pronounced the sentence that had condemned Baptiste to die for stealing an apple. He was the 13th and final name on the list of those who would pay for their crime, the last victim who would be claimed by the forces I had awakened through my grief and rage and love. But his death would not come immediately. The curse I had crafted was designed to make him suffer as I had suffered, to force him to watch as his world crumbled around him, to understand that the power he had thought absolute was nothing compared to the forces he had awakened by murdering an innocent child. The plantation was in complete chaos now, with the enslaved population openly celebrating the deaths of their oppressors and the white community fleeing in terror from forces they could not understand or control. Master Beauregard sat alone in his big house, surrounded by the ghosts of his dead overseers and the knowledge that his own death was approaching with the inexorable certainty of the tide. "Marie," he called to me as I served his dinner on the 12th night, his voice shaking with fear and desperation. "I know you can hear me. I know you're responsible for what's happening here. Please, I'm begging you, stop this madness. I'll do anything you want, give you anything you ask for, just make it stop." But it was too late for begging, too late for bargaining, too late for anything except the justice that had been too long delayed. My son was dead, murdered for the crime of trying to feed his sick sister, and the debt of blood would not be satisfied until the last of his killers had paid the ultimate price. "Tomorrow," I said quietly, my voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Tomorrow you will join your overseers in death. We'll pay the final payment for the life you stole from my child. The spirits are waiting for you, Master Beauregard. They have been patient, but their patience is at an end." The 13th day was about to dawn, and with it would come the final act of justice that had been 13 days in the making. The 13th dawn broke blood red over the Beauregard plantation, painting the Spanish moss and cypress trees in shades of crimson that seemed to prophesy the violence that would conclude before the sun set again. Master Claude Beauregard sat alone in his study, surrounded by the detritus of his crumbling empire. Unpaid bills, letters from creditors, reports of enslaved people fleeing in the chaos that had consumed his once prosperous plantation. 12 of his 13 overseers were dead, claimed by forces that defied rational explanation and followed a pattern that suggested supernatural intervention. The remaining white employees had fled in terror, the neighboring planters refused to visit, and even the local militia had withdrawn after witnessing deaths that challenged their understanding of the natural world. I went about my duties in the big house with the calm satisfaction of someone who knew that justice was finally being served. As I dusted the furniture and swept the floors, I could feel the spiritual forces I had awakened gathering for their final act, preparing to claim the life of the man who had pronounced my son's death sentence with such casual indifference. The 13th voodoo doll, the one that represented Master Beauregard himself, was calling across the veil between worlds with increasing intensity. I could feel its power building like a storm about to break, could sense the spirits of the ancestors sharpening their claws for the feast of vengeance that was about to begin. "Marie," Master Beauregard called to me as I entered his study to clean, his voice hollow with despair and terror. "Sit with me for a moment. I want to talk to you." I paused in my work and looked at him directly, seeing for the first time the full extent of what 12 days of supernatural terror had done to him. His hair had gone completely white, his face was gaunt and lined with premature age, and his hands shook with a tremor that seemed to come from his very soul. "You know what's happening here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You know why my overseers are dying, Why this plantation has become a house of horrors, it's because of your son, isn't it? Because of what we did to Baptiste." "What you did to Baptiste," I corrected, my voice calm and steady despite the magnitude of what was about to occur. "You killed my child for stealing an apple, condemned him to death for trying to feed his sick sister. You and 12 other men decided that his life was worth less than a piece of fruit. It was the law," he protested weakly. "Theft is theft, regardless of the thief's age or motivation. I was enforcing the rules that govern this plantation, maintaining the order that keeps society functioning." "Your law," I replied, feeling the spiritual forces gathering around us like invisible storm clouds. "Your order. Your society built on the blood and suffering of people you refuse to acknowledge as human beings. But there are older laws than yours, Master Beauregard. There are powers in this world that care nothing for your rules and everything for justice." He stared at me with the kind of desperate hope that comes from a drowning man grasping for any available lifeline. "Can you stop it? Can you call off whatever forces you've awakened? I'll free you, free all the slaves on this plantation. I'll give you money, land, whatever you want. Just make it stop." "It's too late for bargains," I said, moving closer to his desk where he sat hunched over like a broken old man. 12 men are dead, and you are the 13th. The count will be complete before this day ends, and the debt will be paid in full." "Please," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I have a wife, children. They don't deserve to suffer for what I've done. If you must have revenge, take it on me alone." "My son had a mother and a sister," I replied, feeling no pity for his tears or his pleas. "He was 14 years old, with his whole life ahead of him. You took that life without thought or hesitation, condemned him to death for the crime of love. Now you will pay the price that justice demands." As if summoned by my words, the spiritual forces that had been building throughout the morning suddenly focused their attention on the study where we sat. The temperature in the room dropped noticeably. The shadows seemed to deepen and move independently of their sources, and the air itself began to thicken with an almost tangible presence. Master Beauregard felt it too, his eyes widening with terror as he sensed the approach of forces beyond his comprehension. "What's happening?" he gasped, his breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. "What's in this room with us?" "Justice," I replied simply. "The spirits of my ancestors, the lower who govern death and retribution, the forces you awakened when you murdered an innocent child, they have come to collect what is owed." The manifestation began slowly, with shadows that moved against the light and sounds that seemed to come from another world entirely. Master Beauregard's desk began to shake, the papers scattered across its surface, rustling as if blown by an unfelt wind. The portraits of his ancestors that lined the walls seemed to watch with accusing eyes, their painted faces shifting and changing as the spiritual realm pressed against the physical world. "No," Master Beauregard whispered, pushing back from his desk and stumbling toward the door. "This isn't real. This can't be happening." But the door slammed shut before he could reach it, the heavy oak panels vibrating as if something massive had struck them from the other side. The windows followed suit, their shutters closing with thunderous crashes that echoed through the house like gunshots. We were sealed in the study together, predator and prey, as the spiritual forces I had awakened prepared to claim their final victim. The temperature continued to drop, and frost began to form on the windows despite the sweltering Louisiana heat outside. Master Beauregard's breath came in visible puffs as he backed against the wall, his eyes wide with terror as he watched the impossible unfold before him. "You're a witch," he gasped, his voice cracking with fear. "A devil worshipper. You've sold your soul to dark forces." "I am a mother," I corrected, feeling the power of the ancestors flowing through me like liquid fire. A mother whose child was murdered by 13 men who thought themselves above the laws of justice. The spirits I serve are not dark. They are the guardians of the innocent, the protectors of those who cannot protect themselves. The air in the room began to shimmer like heat waves, and figures started to materialize in the growing darkness, translucent forms that seemed to be composed of shadow and starlight, the spirits of the ancestors who had answered my call for justice. They moved with purpose and dignity, surrounding Master Beauregard like judges preparing to pronounce sentence. Among them, I could see the spirit of my grandmother, the original Marie Laveau who had taught me the arts I had used to craft this revenge. Her eyes burned with righteous fury as she looked upon the man who had murdered her great-grandson, and her voice echoed in the spiritual realm with words of condemnation and judgment. Claude Beauregard, her spirit intoned, the words seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. You have spilled innocent blood, have murdered a child for the crime of love, have shown no mercy to those under your power. The time has come for you to face the consequences of your actions. Master Beauregard fell to his knees, his body shaking with terror as he found himself surrounded by forces beyond his comprehension or control. "I'm sorry," he sobbed, his voice breaking with desperation. "I'm sorry for what I did to your boy. I was wrong. I was cruel. I was everything you say I was. Please, just let me live. Let me make amends." "Amends?" I asked, my voice carrying the weight of 13 days of accumulated grief and rage. "What amends can bring back my son? What compensation can restore the life you stole from him? You had the power to show mercy when he stood on your gallows, and you chose cruelty instead. Now the spirits will show you the same mercy you showed to Baptiste." The spiritual forces that filled the room began to focus their attention on Master Beauregard with increasing intensity. I could see the life force beginning to drain from his body, could watch as the years of his existence were drawn away by powers that operated according to laws beyond mortal understanding. But this death would not be quick or merciful. The curse I had crafted was designed to make him suffer as my son had suffered, to force him to experience the terror and helplessness that Baptiste had felt as the rope tightened around his neck. Master Beauregard began to age visibly, his hair turning white and falling out, his skin wrinkling and sagging as decades passed in minutes. His body grew frail and weak, his breathing became labored, and his eyes clouded with the approach of death. "Please," he whispered, his voice now barely audible. "Make it stop. I can't breathe." "Neither could my son," I replied, feeling no pity for his suffering. "Neither could Baptiste as your rope crushed his throat and stole his life. You showed him no mercy, and you will receive none in return." The spiritual noose that was claiming Master Beauregard's life tightened with each passing moment, cutting off his air supply with the same inexorable certainty that had killed my child. But unlike Baptiste's quick death, this execution would be prolonged, would force the condemned man to experience every moment of terror and despair that comes with the knowledge that death is approaching and cannot be avoided. As Master Beauregard's life ebbed away, I could feel the presence of my son's spirit joining the ancestors who had gathered to witness this final act of justice. Baptiste appeared to me as he had been in life, young and innocent, full of love and hope despite the circumstances of his birth. His spirit smiled at me with the radiant joy of a child who had finally seen his mother's love vindicated. "Thank you, Mama," his voice whispered in my mind, carrying the warmth and affection that had made his life such a blessing. "Thank you for not letting them get away with what they did to me. Thank you for showing them that even a slave child's life has value, that even the powerless can find ways to strike back against injustice." Master Beauregard's death throes lasted for nearly an hour, his body convulsing as the spiritual forces claimed his life bit by bit, moment by moment. When he finally lay still, his face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, his eyes staring sightlessly at the ceiling, as if he could see the judgment that awaited him in whatever realm his soul had been dragged to. The spiritual forces that had filled the room began to dissipate, their work complete and their justice satisfied. The temperature returned to normal, the shadows retreated to their natural positions, and the oppressive atmosphere that had marked the presence of the ancestors lifted like fog before the morning sun. I stood alone in the study with the body of the man who had murdered my son, feeling a profound sense of completion settle over me like a benediction. 13 men had condemned Baptiste to death, and 13 men had paid the ultimate price for their crime. The debt of blood had been satisfied, and the spirits of the ancestors could rest knowing that justice had been served. The news of Master Beauregard's death spread quickly through what remained of the plantation's population, but by then, most of the enslaved people had already fled to freedom. Understanding that the supernatural events of the past 13 days had effectively destroyed the system that had held them in bondage. The plantation house stood empty, except for me and my daughter Celeste, its rooms echoing with the ghosts of the 13 men who had died for their crimes. The fields lay fallow, the machinery stood idle, and the great house that had once been a symbol of white supremacy and plantation prosperity had become a monument to the terrible price that must be paid when innocent blood is spilled. I remained on the plantation for the rest of my life, not as a slave, but as the guardian of a place where justice had been served, and the spirits of the ancestors had demonstrated their power. Visitors occasionally came to see the woman who had cursed an entire plantation, but most stayed away, understanding that some places were too charged with spiritual energy to be safely approached by the uninitiated. The 13 voodoo dolls that had served as the instruments of divine justice were buried beneath the oak tree where my son had been hanged, their work complete and their power spent. But their influence lived on in the stories that spread throughout the South, tales of a mother who had called down the wrath of the ancestors to avenge her murdered child. 13 dolls, 13 deaths, 13 days became a whispered warning in slave quarters from Virginia to Texas. Don't mess with a voodoo woman's child. Don't spill innocent blood. Don't think that power makes you untouchable. The spirits are watching and they remember everything. The Civil War came and went, slavery was officially abolished, and the world changed around the abandoned plantation where I lived with the ghosts of 13 dead men. But I remained, growing old in the ruins of the system that had tried to destroy my family, a living reminder that some forms of justice transcend human law and operate according to principles older than civilization itself. I died in 1870 at the age of 63, found peacefully in my bed by Celeste, who had stayed with me through all the years of solitude and remembrance. My last words, according to those who were present, were, "Baptiste, Mama is coming home." The plantation was eventually sold and subdivided, but the main house was never successfully occupied again. Every family that tried to live there reported strange occurrences, shadows that moved independently, sounds that came from empty rooms, and an overwhelming sense of being watched by invisible eyes. Local legend claimed that the spirits of the 13 dead men were trapped on the property, condemned to wander the grounds where they had committed their crimes until the end of time. But those who understood the true nature of what had happened knew better. The spirits that haunted the plantation were not those of the guilty, but the guardians who remained to ensure that such injustices would never be repeated. The story of Marie Laveau and her 13 voodoo dolls became part of the folklore that sustained the African American community through the difficult years of Reconstruction and beyond. It was told and retold in countless variations, each version adding new details while preserving the essential message: that love is stronger than hatred, that justice will eventually prevail, and that even the most powerless can find ways to strike back against those who would destroy their families. This was the story of Marie Laveau, who chose love over submission, justice over acceptance, and spiritual power over earthly weakness. Her act of supernatural revenge became a symbol of hope for enslaved people throughout the South, proof that even the most systematic oppression could not permanently destroy the bonds between mother and child or silence the voices of the ancestors who demanded justice for the innocent. The 13 men who murdered her son learned too late that there were forces in the world more powerful than whips and chains, more terrible than any earthly authority, more enduring than the systems of oppression they had served. Their deaths served as a warning to all who would harm the innocent, a demonstration that the universe itself demands payment when children are murdered for the crime of love. The plantation that had once been a symbol of white supremacy and human bondage became a monument to the power of maternal love and spiritual justice, a place where the ancestors had demonstrated their ability to reach across the veil between worlds and claim what was owed to them. Marie's story reminds us that heroism takes many forms, that sometimes the most powerful response to injustice is the willingness to call upon forces beyond human understanding, and that the love between a mother and her child is one of the most sacred bonds in the universe, a bond that not even death can break. The echoes of Marie's story continue to resonate today, a reminder that justice delayed is not always justice denied, that love can transcend death itself, and that those who harm the innocent do so at their own peril. Her tale shows us that there are powers in the world beyond human comprehension, forces that operate according to laws older than civilization and more enduring than any earthly authority. In an age when many people feel powerless against systematic oppression, Marie's example reminds us that there are always resources available to those who know how to access them, that the spiritual realm offers forms of justice that transcend human law, and that the bonds of love and family are among the most powerful forces in the universe. If these stories of courage and supernatural justice inspire you, join our community dedicated to preserving the hidden histories of those who fought back against injustice in all its forms. Subscribe to discover more accounts of spiritual resistance and divine retribution from throughout history, and share your thoughts on how these narratives continue to inform our understanding of justice, family, and the mysterious forces that shape our world. These stories matter not just as historical accounts, but as reminders that love conquers all, that justice will ultimately prevail, and that the universe itself stands with those who protect the innocent against those who would do them harm.